Well, welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October the 23rd. And my name is Pam, and let's begin today's first article. People are bad at predicting their emotions. Is that why we're so polarized? By Elizabeth Zaboda. A professor hunches at her desk until the wee hours, churning out the academic papers she needs for tenure. A sports fan trembles with anxiety as her football team takes the field. A campaign official loses sleep over the prospect of his candidate coming up empty. These high stakes scenarios rest on the same common assumption: achieving the desired outcome, tenure, a team championship, an election victory, will ensure lasting happiness, and falling short will breed deep despair. All of us engage in this kind of effective forecasting, predicting how we're going to feel in the future. But as researchers are discovering, we're not nearly as good at it as we think. Studies show that time after time, our predictions about what will make us happy and what will upset us miss the mark. As the pandemic takes a toll on collective emotional well being, a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention survey conducted in June found that more than 40% of Americans reported adverse mental health. It might be time to reassess our assumptions about happiness. Understanding the nature of forecasting mistakes and why they occur can give a clearer sense of when to believe emotional predictions and when to take them with a big grain of salt. You think that if your team or your candidate loses, you're going to be very miserable for a long time, says New York University marketing professor Tom Mavis, but it doesn't last that long. Likewise, if you win an award or get a great grade on a test, your happiness will probably evaporate sooner than you think. Not only do we tend to oversell how much a future event will affect our happiness, we exaggerate how long the impact will last. In a 2019 study, Texas A&M University psychologist Heather Lench and her colleagues asked groups of people how they thought they'd feel in two different scenarios: if their candidate won or lost an election, or if they got an unexpectedly high or low grade on an exam. Respondents accurately predicted their emotions' intensity in these situations, but they weren't nearly as good as predicting how those emotions would evolve over time. Most of the time, initial feelings dissipated and didn't affect people's overall moods as much as they thought. Humans' frequent emotional forecasting mistakes can affect beliefs and perceptions in surprising ways. Last year, public policy experts at Harvard Kennedy School found that these errors help explain why society is so politically polarized. We think digesting opposing views will upset us more than it actually does, so we avoid those views, consuming mostly content we already agree with, a habit that's hard to dislodge once it gets entrenched. But when we correct our false affective forecasts, we're less apt to seek out biased political information. Down memory lane. Overall, we learn swiftly from our mistakes. Almost no one who touches a hot stove needs to be reminded not to do it again. But when it comes to emotional forecasting, we aren't as quick to catch on. You might think that staying in bed until noon on Saturday will make you happy. But even if it makes you feel like garbage, stinking garbage to boot, you might still be tempted to linger under the covers next weekend. It isn't that we consciously resist learning from our poor forecasts, says Professor Mavis. It's that we often don't have a clear sense of what those forecasts were in the first place. In a series of studies, he and his team showed that people tend to misremember their happiness predictions, revising them to match what reality turned out to be. If a financial windfall doesn't make you as happy as you initially thought, for example, you might assume that you foresaw this disappointment all along. It's tempting to think of memory as opening a little drawer and retrieving the memory, but that's not what happens, Professor Mavis said. You're going to try to reconstruct your feelings based on what your current feelings are. This under the hood reconstruction prevents you from realizing that your initial predictions were way off the mark. And when you're not fully aware of making a forecasting mistake, you're not motivated to correct it. Like scientists peering through a microscope, Most people also engage in what's called focalism when predicting how an event will make us feel. That is, we focus so intently on that event that we gloss over the impact of all the other events that will happen around the same time. When you think about how sad you'll be if you get fired, or if your candidate loses an election, you probably are not thinking about how you'll feel if you make a new friend, summit a mountain, or have your first grandchild in the near future. In reality, though, a never ending parade of life events, some good, some bad, some neutral, reduces the impact of any single event on your well being. When you actually get there, there are a lot of other things happening too, says Professor Lynch. One outcome doesn't affect all of your life. You have other goals and priorities that are also important. The bright side of bias. Even so, some researchers argue that it might not be wise to try to correct all of our emotional forecasting errors. From an evolutionary perspective, they say there are good reasons we make these kinds of mistakes over and over. When we exaggerate the emotional toll of a future negative event, we pull out all the stops to make sure that events doesn't happen. And believing that reaching a goal will bring fulfillment, whether that goal is securing tenure, saving enough to buy a house, or catching a boatload of fish, helps ensure that we survive and thrive. When you're thinking about how intensely happy you'll be when you receive tenure, it keeps you going, Professor Lynch says. People who err on the sunny side in forecasting their feelings might also be better at dealing with obstacles in everyday life. Desiree Colombo, a doctoral candidate at Spain's University Jaume I, asked people to predict what they thought their mood would be over the next 2 weeks. Then her team checked in with them 3 times a day during that time period. People who predicted brighter moods than they actually experienced were more resilient and had better mental health, said Ms. Colombo. So, how do you know if you should go with the flow of your emotional forecasts or push back on them? One wise approach, experts say, is to gain some perspective on your forecasts by looking to your other feelings about them. If anticipating great joy after finishing a presentation inspires you to power through it, your over-optimism might be a positive influence. On the other hand, if you're constantly making yourself miserable by predicting future doom or sacrificing your present well-being to ensure future happiness, it's time to step back and assess your forecast against the broader backdrop of the rest of your life. Almost no triumph will bring as much enduring happiness as we think, and almost no setback is as emotionally devastating as we fear. To the extent that we realize, this has happened to me before, and I survived, Professor Mavis said. That's a good thing. Up next, why Iran is poised to make a comeback as a U.S. priority by Howard LaFranche. In Iran, that burr under the saddle of U.S. presidents and presidential aspirants alike since 1979 may not have been much of an irritating president in this year's presidential campaign or presence. Indeed, with the focus on big domestic issues, including the handling of the coronavirus pandemic, no foreign policy topic is getting much traction. But that doesn't mean Iran is altogether absent, or that it's not poised to come roaring back no matter who takes office in January. It could even happen sooner. Several indicators suggest Iran could soon return to a place of privilege on the U.S. foreign policy agenda. These include the expiration of an international arms embargo on Iran over the weekend, recent advances in Iran's nuclear program despite President Donald Trump's sanctions-based maximum pressure campaign, and prospects under a potential Joe Biden presidency for the United States to return to the multilateral 2015 Iran nuclear deal. But with a difference. There are a number of reasons to think Iran is poised to come back to the agenda once the election is over, but it's not going to be the same debate, with the same focus on the nuclear issues of the exclusion of everything else that we had 5 years ago, says Alex Ventanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute, the MEI in Washington. For starters, The big change looking over the last 5 years is that Iran has become so weak that it has become much easier for the Chinese and the Russians to use the Iranians as a pawn to undermine U.S. interests, he says. At the same time, the nuclear issue, while critical, no longer has a monopoly on what makes Iran a looming foreign policy concern for the U.S. No matter who wins the U.S. election in November, the approach will no longer be limited to how many centrifuges the Iranians have. Mr. Ventanka says, it will have to be a much broader conversation, including Iran's regional activities, what the Trump administration calls exporting revolution. On Sunday, a United Nations arms embargo the Trump administration said was critical to limiting Iran's mischief in the region to air expired. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reiterated the U.S. position that the embargo remains in effect and warned that the U.S. will sanction any company that sells arms to Tehran. The U.S. position sets the stage for a damaging confrontation between the U.S. and some of its closest allies in Europe, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, that remain parties to the formally titled Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. They insist that the U.S. withdrawal from the deal nullifies any U.S. says over its provisions. Also promising Iran's return to the international agenda is evidence of progress in the country's nuclear program. Recent International Atomic Energy Agency reports indicate that Iran's breakout time to building a nuclear weapon is just 3 or 4 months out, in part based on estimates of stockpiled fissile material. That estimate is down sharply from the 1-year breakout time experts assessed when President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA in 2018. In addition, last week, a dissident group with a good track record exposing secret nuclear R&D facilities inside Iran reported the existence of what it said is a previously undisclosed military facility dedicated to Iran's nuclear program. The National Council of Resistance of Iran said in Washington Friday that satellite imagery shows the facility, located in a military zone east of Tehran, had recently been expanded. Even if Iran has not figured prominently in the presidential campaign, what has been said suggests stark differences between the policies of a second-term President Trump and those of a President Biden. Moreover, those differences are also an indicator of the broad foreign policy strategies and goals each would pursue. On Iran, as well as other issues, Mr. Trump would be expected to double down on sanctions and confrontations with allies to advance his foreign policy goals. Those goals for a second Trump administration would include more tightening of the screws on Tehran to force a return to negotiations and achieve what Mr. Trump insists would be a better deal. Mr. Biden, on the other hand, would likely return the U.S. to a multilateral route, seeking to quickly repair relations with key allies in an effort to address international challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, and Iran's advancing nuclear program. Indeed, a Biden administration would likely seek to return the U.S. to the JCPOA. The question would be under what conditions. Some Biden aides have indicated that a Biden administration would condition a U.S. return to the nuclear deal on certain adjustments. Jack Sullivan, a former national security advisor to Mr. Biden when he was vice president, said in an August webinar that a President Biden would follow the same formula used by the Obama administration, which he described as leverage diplomacy backed by pressure, to coax the Iranians back to the negotiating table. The goal, he added, would be a new deal with Iran that makes progress not just on the core nuclear issues, but on some of the other challenges as well, including Iran's missile development and support for regional proxies. Some Republican national security experts say a Biden administration would be wise to use the leverage Mr. Trump's policies have built on a number of key foreign policy issues, including Iran. Through frequent recourse to sanctions and threats to end security guarantees, Trump has generated considerable leverage over adversaries and allies alike, including Iran, writes Richard Fontaine, former foreign policy advisor to the late Senator John McCain, in an October issue of Foreign Affairs. A Biden administration would do well to use some of the leverage Trump would leave behind. Nevertheless, many staunch critics of the JCPOA worry that Mr. Biden, looking to quickly rejoin the nuclear deal, would squander the position of strength the Trump administration has developed vis-a-vis Iran. We must not throw the regime a lifeline or return to the policies of appeasement, says Robert Joseph, who was special envoy for nuclear non-proliferation under President George W. Bush. But others say the Iranians understand that the dire economic and political straits the regime is in means they would have to compromise with whoever is in the White House in 2021. The Iranians know they'd have to make some concessions on the regional front, and maybe even on the bad things they're doing at home to their own people, says MEI and Mr. Vatanka, and that's an opportunity. Our next article, When Homework is Least of Your Worries, How Colleges Help Hungry Students, by Kelly Field. Before the coronavirus shut down his school and workplace, things were looking up for Nicholas Perez, a student at Florida State University. The start of his freshman year had been rough, to be sure. He had spent his first 2 months in Tallahassee, sleeping in his 1996 Ford Ranger and working 40-hour weeks at a pizza joint, trying to save money for an apartment. But by the end of the fall semester, Mr. Perez had moved in with a friend and advanced to a job at a fine dining restaurant. This past March, he purchased a 2013 Hyundai Veloster, the first car I ever bought that was younger than me. 2 weeks later, his life was upended. With coronavirus cases on the rise, the restaurant closed, leaving Mr. Perez short on rent. He asked his landlord, his friend's father, for an extension, and says he got one. But less than a week after the conversation, he returned to the apartment to find the locks changed and his stuff on the street. A note on the door said the family had moved back to Miami. It was pretty devastating, he recalls. At least I had the new car to live in. That was a lot better. Even before the pandemic triggered widespread unemployment, there were tens of thousands of college students without stable housing or enough to eat. Job losses in the restaurant and retail sectors where many students find work only made things worse. Now, some students are months behind on rent, with federal eviction moratoriums set to expire at the end of the year. With federal aid from the coronavirus relief bill mostly depleted and potentially a tough winter ahead, colleges are finding new ways to respond. There are things we've been asking for a long time that are starting to happen, says Sarah Goldrick-Robb, director of the Hope Center for College Community and Justice at Temple University. We really are seeing the facility lean in, asking, how do I communicate care? To help students find resources easily, colleges are creating basic need websites and professors are adding information about available supports to course syllabi. Dr. Goldrick-Robb says they are also reaching out in more personal ways. Florida State, which offers a program for students who have experienced homelessness or foster care, held its freshman mixer online this year, delivering restaurant meals to students' homes so they could eat together, apart. A need-seeking majority. Nearly 3 in 5 college students were experiencing basic need insecurity in the spring, according to a recent survey by the Hope Center. The rates for Black and Hispanic students were even higher at 71% and 65%. Colleges responded at that time with millions of dollars in aid to students, including from the federal relief bill. They gave institutional grants to international and undocumented students who were eligible for federal aid. After abrupt closures, many let students remain on campus if they had nowhere else to go. Some schools kept a dining hall open with limited hours. Others handed out gift cards to grocery stores or let students order from the food pantry online rather than shopping in person. Staff delivered groceries to students who lived off campus without transportation and helped students who had left the area find food in their communities. Some colleges even recruited faculty to help them find students experiencing food and housing insecurity. At California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, administrators asked facilities to flag students who seemed in need of additional support. At Kennesaw State University in Georgia, staff trained professors on how to recognize the warning signs of food and housing insecurities in online classes, such as a reluctance to turn on video. With students back on campus this fall, the college has started sending food to mailboxes at its Marietta campus, so students who place an order online don't need to come to the Kennesaw Food Pantry to collect it. Still, without walk-ins, Kennesaw's pantry isn't serving nearly as many students as it normally does, says Marcy Stidham, who created and now directs the college program for students who have experienced homelessness and foster care. She attributes the roughly 40% drop to students and faculty spending less time together in person this year, since some classes are online. We're missing people that we know would have been referred to us if it weren't for COVID, Ms. Stidham said. And like Horton and the Who, we were shouting, "We are here! We are here!" Students step up for classmates. 7 months after the relief bill cleared Congress, the future of a second economic relief bill is uncertain. Many public colleges face budget cuts that will make it harder for them to meet students' needs going forward. So, students are stepping up too, creating spreadsheets and matching programs that let students and faculty share resources with those in need. On some campuses, students have built mutual aid networks that have raised thousands of dollars in emergency aid for their classmates. We know that there are quite a few students who can pay the full cost of attendance, says Yannick Omiton, a senior at George Washington University, who helped start its mutual aid network. We figured what we can do here is redistribute some of that money. Meanwhile, Mr. Perez, the Florida State student, is back at work at a local cafe and able to afford an off-campus apartment. His lease is up in December, but he's not feeling too stressed about it. He says he knows his school will help him find housing and employment if he loses them again. As long as I keep going through school, working hard, I think I'll be okay, he says. I'm pretty resilient. And up next, navigating the boundaries of thrift. It's an old-fashioned virtue, but it persists in my life and that of Maine. There are limits, though, by Robert Close. One of the most valuable and persistent life lessons I received from my Depression-era parents was the concept of thrift. The word doesn't have currency today, and with good reason. We live in a throwaway culture where it is often cheaper to replace an item than repair it. And even when a repair is cheap and easy to accomplish, think of putting a patch on a pair of jeans. The very idea seems quaint or unthinkable or a waste of time. What's being overlooked here is the joy of thrift, the idea of renewing something and giving it a second life. Let me explain by way of example. Years ago, I was visiting family in New Jersey. I was sitting at the table, eating a piece of peach pie out of the aluminum pan it came in. When I was done, I asked my brother, what should I do with the pan? His response was, throw it away. After living many years in utilitarian Maine, I was horrified at the thought and told him the following. In Maine, when you open a can of peas, you use the lid and bottom of the can to nail up mouse holes. Then you cut the can and flatten it for use as a spare shingle. You use the label of the can. Sorry about the dog, I didn't know she was here. You use the label of the can as a garden marker, and of course, you eat the peas. After this little speech, my brother, clearly unimpressed, took the pie pan, crumbled it up, and threw it away. My heart sank, but what could I do? I was clearly in enemy territory. And so, I quietly and persistently pursue the joy of thrift. As the heels and toes of my socks give out, I lay them aside. I wait for a cold, snowy winter evening. I light a fire, put on some music, snuggle into a sofa, and languidly darn the socks. one after the other. In the hectic rush of daily life, my socks counsel me to slow down and dwell in the gift of a quiet evening. Beyond this grace, I am rewarded with a pile of born-again socks. I know it would save time to simply throw the socks out and buy new ones, but that would deny me a cozy interlude. I live in a university town. Down the road from me is a neighbor, Roxanne, who drives a pickup. One of her great joys is dumpster diving near the student dormitories. Every so often she stops at my house and, like an itinerant peddler of yore, asks, "What do you need?" I go out to her truck and am agog at the gleanings. Designer shirts, coffee makers, fans, shoes still in the box, kitchen utensils, ball caps, and yes, brand new pairs of socks. The students have thrown all of these things out, but their lack of heed in the source of Roxanne's joy, which is magnified by her desire to share with others. In extolling the virtue of thrift, I know to avoid going overboard. There is a line between thrift and hoarding. I can use an extra cardboard box, but I harbor no need to warehouse every box that comes my way. I do, however, appreciate people who not only know what thrift is, but practice it. Sometimes we even try to outdo each other. I recently told a friend, when I eat ice cream bars, I save the wooden sticks for mixing paint. "Oh yeah," he replied, "I save my used dental floss and use it to tie up my tomato plants." You win. Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October 23rd. You be safe until we meet here again. Be blessed and do what you can do to make it a great day. This is Pam saying have a good one.